You're a fraud. The word landed cleanly, without heat, without hesitation. My father said it the way someone reads a line they've practiced in private. We were already seated, knees tucked under a long oak table that had belonged to my grandmother longer than I'd been alive. No one moved. No one reached for water or shifted in their chair. It was as if the room had been waiting for that sentence to be spoken out loud. I didn't answer him. I kept my hands folded in my lap, fingers pressed together the way I'd learned to do years ago when reacting only made things worse. My mother stared at the grain in the wood. Dylan leaned back slightly, his expression careful, rehearsed. Sarah watched me with something like curiosity, not concern. Aunt Valerie inhaled sharply and then went still. I was used to this posture. The quiet one. The one everyone assumed would absorb whatever was said and keep going. For the last 7 years, that had been my role. I was the one who drove Ruth to her appointments. The one who filled her pill organizer every Sunday. The one who stayed overnight when she forgot where she was and woke up frightened. It had never been announced or praised. It had simply happened, the way unpaid work often does. My father's accusation hovered between us. Fraud. It suggested intent, deception, something active and ugly. I had spent most of my adult life doing the opposite of that. Showing up quietly. Leaving quietly. Making sure the lights were off and the doors were locked. Making sure Ruth ate, bathed, remembered herself. Mr. Ellison sat at the far end of the table with a slim folder in front of him. He hadn't reacted either. That unsettled me more than my father's voice. Lawyers usually rush to clarify, to soften language, to keep things procedural. He did none of that. He adjusted his glasses once and looked at me, not unkindly, but carefully, as if confirming something he already knew. My father went on, his tone steady. He spoke about sacrifice, about family, about people who take credit for work they didn't really do. He never raised his voice. That made it harder to interrupt. Calm accusations have a way of sounding reasonable, even when they're not. I noticed small things instead. The way Ruth's empty chair remained pulled slightly away from the table. The faint hum of the old wall clock. The fact that no one asked me if I wanted to respond. When Mr. Ellison finally spoke, it wasn't to defend me. Before we proceed, he said, closing the folder gently, there is something in Ruth's documentation that may change how this conversation unfolds. No one looked at me then. But I felt the room shift. The table had been arranged before we arrived, which meant the hierarchy was already decided. My father sat closest to Mr. Ellison, angled slightly forward, his forearms resting on the wood as if proximity alone could confer authority. My mother took the chair beside him, posture composed, hands folded neatly, eyes lowered in a way that suggested patience rather than submission. Dylan and Sarah sat opposite me, close enough that their knees nearly touched under the table. Aunt Valerie claimed the end near the window, where the light fell best and made listening look like participation. I was placed where a chair happened to be open. No one offered to move. Confidence in that room did not announce itself loudly. It showed up in small, unguarded habits. Dylan crossed his legs and checked his watch once, a quick glance, as if the outcome were already scheduled. Sarah kept her phone face down on the table, palm resting over it, signaling she was present but not invested. My father leaned back only after Mr. Ellison began speaking, satisfied now that the attention was anchored where he wanted it. I waited. Waiting had become a skill. Mr. Ellison cleared his throat and slid a single page from the folder. He didn't read yet. He let the paper sit there, visible, its weight implied. The room responded immediately. My father straightened. Dylan's foot stopped tapping. Aunt Valerie's gaze sharpened, her mouth set into a line that meant calculation had begun. Greed rarely looks like hunger. It looks like certainty. Like the assumption that what's coming belongs to you because it always has. Mr. Ellison spoke in a measured cadence, explaining that Ruth's estate would be addressed item by item, as specified. No deviations. No commentary. He emphasized procedure, the order of things, as if to remind everyone that patience mattered more than posture. I noticed how my mother nodded at that, once, slowly, the way she did when she believed rules would protect her. The first item was small, almost trivial. A parcel of land Ruth had owned decades ago, leased now, modest in value compared to the rest. Mr. Ellison read the beneficiary's name without looking up. It wasn't mine. Dylan exhaled, a sound he tried to swallow. Sarah's fingers tightened slightly around her phone. My father allowed himself the faintest smile, the kind meant to be reasonable, not triumphant. Aunt Valerie shifted forward, already aligning herself with the direction of the wind. I felt the familiar pressure to disappear, to make myself smaller so the room could expand around the winners. Instead, I focused on the paper in front of Mr. Ellison, on the order he insisted on keeping. If this was the beginning, I thought, then the middle would tell us who we really were. Mr. Ellison reached for the next page, and the quiet in the room thickened. Mr. Ellison continued in the same even tone, moving from one document to the next as if he were reading weather reports instead of a will that had quietly shaped all our expectations. Accounts were named. Jewelry was listed. A vehicle, an old one Ruth had kept longer than anyone thought practical, was assigned with a brief explanation attached, a note in her handwriting that Mr. Ellison summarized but did not read aloud. Each item landed softly, but the room reacted anyway, through posture, through breath, through restraint that barely held. Dylan received 2 things in succession. Nothing dramatic, but enough to confirm what he already believed. Sarah reached for his hand under the table, a gesture meant to look supportive but felt proprietary. My father nodded once, satisfied, while my mother's expression remained carefully neutral, as if neutrality itself were a contribution. Aunt Valerie smiled at the appropriate moments, her approval flexible, her loyalty clearly negotiable. I listened for my name the way you listen for a train you're not sure is coming. Not with hope, exactly. More with readiness. Each pause between pages stretched longer than the one before, and still nothing arrived. Mr. Ellison did not glance at me. He did not glance at anyone. He stayed focused on the sequence Ruth had left behind. There is a particular kind of tension that builds when people begin to notice absence. It is quieter than disappointment and sharper than patience. I felt it settle around me as the list grew longer. Assets were distributed. Responsibilities were named. Explanations were offered only when the document required it. Still, my name did not surface. Dylan noticed first. His confidence shifted into something else, a flicker of confusion he quickly masked by leaning back in his chair. Sarah followed his lead, her face smoothing into polite disinterest. My father's jaw tightened just enough to signal irritation. My mother lowered her eyes again, this time not in patience but in calculation. I remained still. Years of caregiving had taught me that waiting without expectation is a form of control. You learn to listen past what is being said and focus instead on what is being delayed. Mr. Ellison paused to adjust his glasses. The sound of paper sliding against paper felt louder than it should have. Aunt Valerie cleared her throat and then thought better of it. The room had entered that fragile stage where everyone knows the balance could tip, but no one wants to be the one who pushes. That was when Dylan leaned forward. "Excuse me," he said, cutting across the lawyer's rhythm, his voice casual but edged with impatience. "Are we missing something here?" The interruption landed heavier than any accusation. Mr. Ellison looked up for the first time, his expression unreadable. I felt the shift immediately. Whatever order Ruth had designed was about to be tested, and my brother had just stepped into it. Dylan's interruption cracked something open that had been waiting all along. He didn't raise his voice, but accusation doesn't need volume when it has permission. He said my name like it was evidence already entered into record. He spoke about questions, about clarity, about how strange it was that someone like me, who had no visible assets and no impressive career titles, had been so involved in Ruth's daily life. My father followed quickly, his words sharper, less careful. That was when he said it plainly. That I was a fraud. That I had positioned myself. That I had benefited quietly while everyone else was busy living real lives. The room changed temperature. Sarah straightened in her chair. My mother folded her hands as if this were a long-anticipated moment finally arriving on schedule. Aunt Valerie watched with interest that bordered on relief. It was easier, I realized, for them to believe this version than to question the one they had lived with for years. I answered slowly, not defensively, just clearly. I reminded them of dates, routines, hospital schedules, the fact that caregiving is not invisible to the person being cared for, even if it is to everyone else. I didn't list sacrifices. I didn't describe exhaustion. I spoke only to what could be verified. That restraint frustrated them more than anger ever could. Mr. Ellison lifted a hand. Not abruptly, but firmly enough to stop the momentum. He explained, in plain language, something most people only learn when it's too late. That accusations like these, made during probate, are not harmless opinions. They can delay distribution. They can trigger reviews. They can freeze assets while claims are evaluated. Probate does not reward certainty. It responds to procedure. My father scoffed. Dylan tried to laugh it off. But the idea had already landed. I saw it register. This wasn't a family argument anymore. It was a legal environment, and they had just contaminated it. Mr. Ellison closed the folder in front of him, just for a moment. He said we would pause. That the room needed to reset. That nothing further would be read until order was restored. That was when I noticed how quickly confidence drains when structure reasserts itself. And I understood something important. They had accused me to gain ground. Instead, they had stalled everything. When they talked about my grandmother as if she had been a ledger, I kept thinking about mornings. Not the dramatic ones, just the ordinary hours no one remembers later. I was there before sunrise most days, when the house still smelled like last night's tea and the floorboards were cold. I helped Ruth sit up slowly, the way she preferred, counting under her breath so the dizziness wouldn't catch her off guard. Medication first, always with applesauce, because swallowing pills dry scared her. Breakfast was oatmeal unless she asked for toast, and she only asked on days she felt strong. Caregiving is repetitive in a way that erases witnesses. You learn the patterns of another body. The way pain announces itself quietly. The way pride hides weakness. Ruth never wanted help in front of others, so I became invisible by design. I handled appointments, bills, refills, and notes taped inside cabinets so she wouldn't forget what she had already taken. I listened to the same stories again and again, and I answered as if each telling was the first. That was our rhythm. It didn't look impressive. It just looked steady. The rest of the family visited in bursts. Holidays. Birthdays. Occasional Sundays that came with flowers and left with photos. They hugged her carefully, as if age were contagious, and asked how she was doing without waiting for the answer. Ruth noticed. She never complained, but she squeezed my hand harder after they left. Once, late in the evening, she said, "You see me." It wasn't gratitude. It was recognition. I remembered how rarely anyone else came by when she was sick. How often I cancelled plans without mentioning it. How absence becomes easier to defend when it's shared. No one likes being reminded that showing up consistently is its own form of truth. What unsettled me later wasn't the accusation itself. It was how quickly they assumed proximity equaled manipulation. As if care could only exist with an agenda. As if love needed witnesses to be valid. That night, after the will reading paused, I walked back through Ruth's house in my memory and realized something else. Toward the end, small things had begun to vanish. Papers moved. Drawers rearranged. Items she used daily no longer where she left them. At the time, I blamed confusion. Now, I wasn't so sure. After that first realization, I started paying attention to details I had brushed aside before. It wasn't just misplaced papers or a missing envelope. It was patterns. Ruth had been meticulous. She labeled folders, stacked mail by date, and kept important documents in a locked cabinet near the study. When something went missing, she noticed immediately. Confusion looked scattered. This felt selective. A week before her health declined sharply, she mentioned wanting an extra set of eyes on the house. Not because she was afraid, but because she believed in order. She had lived through enough family disputes to know that estates don't fall apart from strangers. They fracture from familiarity. Quietly, she asked me to call a company that specialized in discreet home security. No alarms blaring. No signs in the yard. Just documentation. I didn't think much of it at the time. I thought it was about her feeling safe. Later, I learned that modern estates are protected less by locks and more by records. Cameras don't accuse. They observe. Timestamps don't argue. They simply exist. When assets are involved, especially before probate begins, documentation becomes the only neutral witness. Most families never think they'll need it. Ruth did. When the lawyer explained, weeks later, how estates are safeguarded during transitions, it sounded clinical. Property is inventoried. Access is logged. Irregular movement is flagged. These aren't accusations. They're safeguards designed to prevent confusion from becoming conflict. Or theft from becoming invisible. Listening to him then, I felt my stomach tighten. Not from fear. From recognition. I hadn't connected those quiet upgrades to what was unfolding in that room. I thought they were just another precaution from a woman who planned everything in advance. I didn't realize how far ahead she had been thinking. Mr. Ellison cleared his throat and stood, moving toward the wall where a screen had been dark the entire time. He didn't look at me when he pressed the button. The room shifted before the image even appeared. The screen didn't light up all at once. It faded in slowly, like it was giving the room time to prepare. A date appeared in the corner. Then a hallway I recognized immediately. Ruth's house. The angle was high, wide, unflattering. It showed everything without commentary. No sound. No drama. Just movement. At first, no one spoke because nothing seemed unusual. A door opened. A figure crossed the frame. Someone paused near the cabinet in the study. It could have been anyone. That uncertainty held for several seconds, long enough for relief to flicker across a few faces. Then the figure turned toward the camera. It was my father. Not startled. Not hesitant. He moved with familiarity, as if the space belonged to him. He opened the cabinet with a key. The timestamp rolled forward. Another date appeared. A different day. Dylan this time. He didn't look around. He went straight to the same place. The camera caught the moment his hand hesitated, not out of doubt, but calculation. He removed an item and slid it into his jacket. The angle showed his face clearly. Calm. Certain. Sarah shifted beside him. Not in shock. In recognition. No one accused. No one explained. Mr. Ellison didn't narrate. He let the footage breathe. Valerie's mouth tightened. My mother's hands folded tighter in her lap. I watched the screen, not because I needed proof, but because I wanted to understand how ordinary betrayal looks when it's stripped of excuses. The footage continued. Short clips. Different days. Different items. Always the same cabinet. Always the same confidence. What struck me most was how unremarkable it all seemed. No urgency. No panic. Just quiet entitlement. When the screen went dark again, the silence was heavier than any argument could have been. My father stared straight ahead. Dylan swallowed, once, hard. Mr. Ellison closed the laptop and returned to the table without comment. There is, he said evenly, one remaining file relevant to this estate. No one asked what it was. The room had shifted. Denials that had sounded confident before now trembled under the weight of evidence. Dylan opened his mouth, trying again to claim misunderstanding, an innocent mistake, but the words faltered halfway. His posture, once loose with assumed control, tightened. Every glance he cast around the table carried hesitation. Sarah mirrored it, her confidence ebbing as if the footage had revealed something she could not retract. My father, usually the anchor of family poise, now seemed uneasy in the way people do when reality overtakes belief. He attempted to interject, but Mr. Ellison spoke first, measured, unflinching, and precise. The law is clear. Intentional removal of estate property constitutes a violation. These items are part of the decedent's legally documented assets. Any claims otherwise are secondary to documented evidence. His voice carried authority that silenced objections not through volume, but through procedural weight. Valerie shifted uncomfortably, her hands pressing together. I watched her closely. She had been quietly assessing the room, as if she had anticipated that the structure of truth would eventually reveal itself without theatrics. Now, faced with the camera's impartial gaze, she could not manufacture defense or distraction. Dylan's confidence had been his armor. Now, it felt threadbare. He reached for explanation but found no rhythm for words. Each attempted denial fell into the quiet, unresponsive air. Sarah's face betrayed the smallest flicker of guilt, the unspoken acknowledgement that she had participated in an act she could not justify. My mother, though seated near the edge of the table, gave no instruction, offered no advocacy. She had positioned herself as observer for so long, but now the legal clarity removed her influence entirely. I remained silent. Not a smile, not a nod, not a word. My eyes met no one but the evidence itself, the silent testament that had exposed misdeeds that had always been whispered about behind closed doors. Quiet, unembellished truth carried more authority than any argument. Every family member's posture shifted subtly in response, and in that subtlety, I felt the weight of morality asserting itself over entitlement. Then, as if the gravity had not yet reached its full expression, a small, almost imperceptible cough drew attention. All heads turned toward my grandmother, Ruth. She had been silent throughout, her presence understated, yet commanding in its calm. She lifted a hand and spoke in a voice that was soft, deliberate, and unmistakably firm. The room paused, holding its collective breath. "My granddaughter," she said, and her eyes found mine, "you have always understood what respect truly means." Ruth's gaze held the room captive. She did not raise her voice, she did not demand attention. Yet every head turned as if drawn by gravity. "There is one thing you must understand," she began, her tone measured. "The distribution of an estate is not only about assets. It is about the values we leave behind." She paused, letting the weight of the room settle on her words. "There are morality clauses written into this will. They are clear. Actions taken in bad faith, in neglect or deceit, affect one's standing in the inheritance." I listened quietly, every syllable a confirmation of what I had long suspected. The clauses were not simply legal technicalities, they were instruments meant to reflect the ethical foundation my grandmother had built. Her estate was more than money. It was the embodiment of family accountability. Any deviation from responsibility had consequences that were enforceable, and now, the room realized how structured and deliberate these consequences were. Dylan's face tightened. He attempted a dismissive cough, a gesture meant to minimize the gravity of Ruth's words, but it landed hollow. The clauses she referenced were precise, enforceable, and backed by documentation. His previous assumptions, bolstered by overconfidence and entitlement, were collapsing under the authority of both law and moral design. Mr. Ellison, sitting beside Ruth, nodded once, his hand moving toward the next set of documents. Without dramatics, he began to outline the enforcement measures quietly, step by step. "Any transfer of assets or authority that contravenes these clauses will be reversed automatically," he explained. "Security protocols, financial oversight, and legal controls are in place to ensure compliance." His voice was calm, almost clinical, but it carried the weight of inevitability. Sarah shifted uncomfortably beside Dylan. She had hoped complicity would remain unnoticed, but Ruth's clarity left no room for ambiguity. Every action, every choice in the recent past had been observed, logged, and now evaluated. The morality clause was not an abstract idea. It was tangible, actionable, and irreversible. I remained composed, my heartbeat steady. Vindication did not demand celebration. I had not raised my voice, nor had I needed to. The combination of Ruth's words and the procedural clarity of Mr. Ellison rendered any counterargument unnecessary. My role as caregiver, my patience, my consistent integrity, all stood visible and recognized without a single boast. Valerie exhaled lightly, perhaps the first acknowledgement from extended family that the situation was no longer in Dylan's control. The subtle shift in the air was almost imperceptible, yet undeniable. The power balance, once assumed by arrogance and familial expectation, had irrevocably changed. Ruth continued, her eyes briefly meeting each of us in turn. "I have designed this to protect those who act with care, and to correct those who act selfishly. Let this serve as guidance and correction, not only in estate matters but in life." Her words landed like quiet authority, and I felt the weight of her intention settle firmly. As Mr. Ellison began activating the first enforcement measures, the room's dynamic shifted palpably. Dylan's attempted authority crumbled further under procedural certainty. Every action had been anticipated, every loophole closed. I remained still, poised, and entirely aware that the moment of irreversible accountability had begun. The enforcement procedures unfolded silently, methodically. The room held its collective tension, knowing that each legal motion, each protective step, would reinforce the moral and ethical structure my grandmother had entrusted to this estate. And in that quiet, controlled orchestration, it became unmistakable. Justice was moving forward. The first corrective measure was underway, and there would be no turning back. The weeks following the reading were not loud, but they were decisive. Dylan's attempts to assert control over the estate had failed before he even realized the procedural weight he was facing. Transfers he had anticipated as his by default were halted, reversed, or reallocated quietly through the mechanisms Ruth had ensured. He walked the halls of our family home with a posture of confidence that was slowly eroding, each step heavier than the last. Sarah tried to maintain a composed front, but her subtle fidgets betrayed the recognition that the old assumptions had collapsed. Legal letters, formal notices, and notarized documents arrived with methodical precision. Each outlined changes in asset control and guardianship responsibilities, quietly shifting the authority away from Dylan without fanfare. Family advisors, accountants, and trustees followed the letter of the will. I observed without comment, allowing the process to run its course. Every motion, every correction reinforced the deliberate structure Ruth had created to protect integrity and accountability. My father, who had initially been stern and incredulous, now regarded me with something closer to measured acknowledgement. There were no apologies, no declarations of admiration. His silence carried weight, the kind that only comes from observing that logic and procedure have triumphed where words cannot. My mother, ever proud of appearances, could only witness the erosion of the social narrative she had supported. Even Valerie, the aunt who had quietly monitored family tensions, nodded once in private acknowledgement of the shift in reality. Dylan tried to argue, to negotiate, to reclaim influence over assets he had assumed were his. Each attempt met with formal procedure, each insistence dismissed politely yet firmly. The power he thought inherent in his familial position was evaporating in the face of documented oversight, morality clauses, and ethical enforcement. The collapse was complete not with anger, but with an irreversible chain of controlled legal actions. I did not speak of the satisfaction this brought. My focus remained on stability, for myself, for the family members who had acted responsibly, and most importantly for Ruth's legacy. The assets, the responsibilities, the oversight, all were now aligned with her values rather than entitlement. I had been the quiet observer, the patient executor of moral rectitude, and that patience had rendered loud confrontation unnecessary. Family dinners continued, though the dynamics had irrevocably shifted. Dylan's presence was now marked by caution, hesitation, and a subtle defensiveness that had never existed before. Conversations he tried to steer were met with deliberate neutrality or polite redirection. His social confidence had dwindled, replaced by an awareness of procedural authority he could not manipulate. Sarah's complicity was similarly muted. She understood that even her whispers of influence could no longer override the structured protections in place. I remained composed, always present but never reactive. Each interaction was a quiet assertion of stability, patience, and foresight. The documents, the law, and the moral clauses were my allies, ensuring that no verbal confrontation was necessary for lasting consequences. Relationships that had been toxic or coercive began to realign according to genuine respect and ethical conduct rather than fear or inherited assumptions. In this environment, the estate's original purpose, to uphold family integrity and protect those who acted with care, was finally realized. It was no longer a matter of proving worth through argument or confrontation. The mechanisms Ruth had built ensured that responsibility and integrity were recognized and rewarded, while negligence and entitlement were corrected quietly but irrevocably. As the months passed, I observed Dylan's professional and personal opportunities subtly contract under the weight of public perception and private legal reality. Even within our extended family, his credibility suffered. Actions once taken for granted now met with scrutiny. Privileges once assumed were withheld, enforced by documentation and authority. The silent yet tangible shift was complete. 1 year later, the family would gather again, though the shadows of the previous reading still lingered. The consequences of patience, procedural diligence, and ethical clarity were evident in every arrangement, every conversation, every glance. And I remained composed, knowing that the work of quiet justice was done. The calendar had turned, and the room would gather again, but I would enter not as accused, but as the one whose patience had reshaped everything. The year had passed with quiet steadiness. Life settled into routines, measured and deliberate, guided by the clarity of values that had been tested and confirmed. My mornings began with my own reflection, noting the tangible effect of patience and adherence to principle. The weight of past accusations had lifted, replaced by a calm, unshakable awareness that integrity endures even when unnoticed or doubted. I watched my daughter grow into confidence, her curiosity matched by her sense of security. She moved freely in the home and community, recognized and respected by those who valued character above entitlement. The lessons I had absorbed in silence, the importance of careful observation, restraint, and methodical action, were now reflected in the small moments I shared with her, moments that required no words to convey strength and guidance. The estate, the assets, and the family authority had realigned without spectacle. No one needed a dramatic confrontation, no speeches were required. The mechanisms built by my grandmother, enforced quietly by law and moral clarity, had done their work. Observing this, I felt a sense of completion, a satisfaction untainted by the desire for retaliation. Consequences had been meted out in accordance with values, not emotion, and that was enough. I did not boast, nor did I seek recognition. The subtle victories, the correction of misunderstandings, the realignment of responsibility, the protection of the next generation, were evident in the daily calm, the measured interactions, and the enduring respect of those who observed with insight. Even the once assertive voices of entitlement had diminished, replaced by a cautious awareness that quiet diligence carries more force than any shouting could. Reflecting on it, I understood the true weight of legacy. It is not money alone, nor prominence, but the assurance that integrity guides action, that care and responsibility are recognized, and that the next generation inherits more than assets, they inherit dignity and stability. I had not needed to prove myself with anger or display. I had only needed patience, observation, and the quiet execution of principle. The camera, once a silent observer, had recorded truth without bias. The moments of accusation and doubt now existed only in memory, outweighed by the enduring evidence of ethical action. I knew that others might never speak openly of it, might never acknowledge it, yet its presence was undeniable. As I watched my daughter organize her books, she paused and smiled, unaware of the careful orchestration that had protected her and ensured the integrity of our family's values. I felt a quiet pride, tempered by humility and understanding. This was the strength of silence, the authority of patience, and the fulfillment of legacy. In the stillness, I understood, justice does not always roar. Sometimes, it waits, watches, and quietly rearranges the world until truth stands undeniable. My role was complete, the lesson enduring. And in that calm, the room, and my heart, knew that the work of generations had settled exactly as it should.